Okay, thank you very much for attending this very special Egypt Centre event. And it's called The Highlights of the Collection of James Roberts Ogden. The event's going to feature several exciting talks about Ogden and his collection, and it's going to be followed by a launch of an exhibition of artefacts on loan from Harrogate Museums. Now, today is also a very special day for us, because as Alan will remember, 26 years ago today, and Carolyn sitting at the back, the Egypt Centre was officially opened 26 years ago today. Now, we're very pleased to welcome you all on Zoom and in person in the room, but we want to give a special warm welcome to our esteemed colleagues from Harrogate and our distinguished guests, the members of the Ogden family. I won't keep you much longer because I'm sure you're as excited as I am to hear all the talks and see the exhibition. But first, a few housekeeping sort of rules, really. Can you please switch your phones off, put them on silent? Unfortunately, we can't use these doors. So the doors at the back of the room are the ones for you to use. And if you do need to use the facilities, the loos are just opposite the doors there. Just walk straight through and you'll see the toilets. Now, we are not scheduled a fire alarm test today. They haven't told us we're having one. So if we do hear the fire alarm bells going, members of staff will direct you to assembly point 2 and we will show you the nearest fire exit. So just follow us. So and of course, if you do want to tweet or X us, okay, it's at the Egypt Centre, one word. So that would be lovely. I'm now going to hand you over to our amazing curator, Dr. Kenneth Griffin.
Thank you, Wendy. I assume everybody can hear me on Zoom with the mic change over there. Hopefully we get a few acknowledgements there from Sam. Yeah, all okay. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming along today to this event to launch our second Harrogate exhibition. And as Wendy says, it's a great honour to have our colleagues down from Harrogate, especially the Ogden family, who's travelled 5 hours down in the car today. So quite a long journey, and they've been up since well before 6 o'clock this morning. What we're going to be doing over the next 2 hours is just really having a look at the Ogden collection, this fantastic group of objects that came to us via the Harrogate collection. I'm going to start off with a little bit of the history of the collection itself in terms of how it came to Swansea. Some of you may be familiar with this, but in the 28th of February last year, a group of 813 objects arrived from Harrogate Museums on loan to the Egypt Centre for 3 years. This made the BBC News as well as other international media, really highlighting this collaborative project that we have between the Egypt Centre and Harrogate Museums. I don't know if anybody in the audience, either in person or on Zoom, has been to Harrogate and seen the collection. I know a few people here have. But parts of the collection were displayed in the Royal Pump Room Museum, which you can see on the screen here, which is a fantastic building. For those of you that have been there before, I'm sure you'll know that. But Harrogate was well known, of course, for its spas, its Victorian spas, and would attract a lot of visitors back in the day. Only a small collection of the Egyptian antiquities were on display in this case, which you can see on the left-hand side. But this is only a very small collection of the greater number of 800 plus Egyptian objects that were part of the collection, most of which were kept in storage. Of course, the highlight of the collection is this mask on the right-hand side, this famous mask of Anubis, which is now on display in the House of Death Gallery at the Egypt Centre. But you can see it on display up in the top left, well, middle left of the exhibition there. That's not from the Ogden collection, but there were 2 main collectors, which I'll be coming on to in a little bit. So how did the objects actually come here to Swansea? Well, it all happened just over 2 years ago when Sam Powell, who many of you will know sitting in the room here, went to Harrogate in order to study this small wooden funerary figure from Beni Hassan as part of her PhD research on this particular type of objects. It was during her visit at that time that she had discussions with the the curators, May and Karen at Harrogate, and discuss ways of potentially getting the collection more accessible. Very few Egyptologists knew that Harrogate did have a collection of Egyptian antiquities up there. And Sam suggested that perhaps Harrogate collaborate with the Egypt Centre, where the objects could come here as a temporary loan, where they could be researched not just by the staff at the Egypt Centre and the academic department, but also from the students. We do a lot of hands-on object-based learning here at Swansea. It's one of our real strengths. And that fitted in very well with what Harrogate were looking for. And after several months, largely of the usual legal paperwork in order to get the loan to happen, the objects arrived here on the 28th of February. It was quite an exciting day, as you can imagine. It was all kept under I suppose, all kept quiet until the objects arrived here for security reasons. And here you can see one of the objects being unboxed by Constantine, this large coffin, which is now in the storage at the minute. So very exciting day for us all at the Egypt Centre. And here we have May, who came down and with the objects, accompanied them. This is her on the day that the objects arrived, with the famous mask of Anubis unboxing in the Egypt Centre store. I'm not going to be talking about Anubis any further, I don't think anyway, but just to mention that there are two collectors from whom the Egyptian collection really materialized from, and who donated their collections to Harrogate museums. On the left, you have Benjamin Kent, who is holding this pre-dynastic vessel, which is on display in our House of Life gallery. And on the right, you have James Roberts Ogden, who will be the focus of today's event. Before we move on to Ogden himself, just a little bit about the other collector, Benjamin William John Kent, who lived in this very nice place. This is Tatefield Hall. Up until recently, it was still in the possession of the Kent family, but it's recently been sold. And in this house, he created himself a nice museum, as a lot of collectors 100 years or so ago did. In the photograph on the left-hand side, you can see him holding some of the objects from his collection. And this included objects that were not just Egyptian. He had objects from all over the world, but particularly from the Mediterranean, Egypt, etc. Some objects from South America as well. And it really was a museum. It was well known, not just in the Harrogate region, but from Egyptologists, etc., some of whom published aspects of his collection. Here's a photograph just looking inside his house to show you what it was like. There's cases everywhere, objects everywhere. There looks as if there's no real arrangement in terms of the objects themselves. On top of this shelf, which hopefully my pointer is moving around, the minute you can see some copper alloy statues of Osiris and other Egyptian gods. There's pottery. There's some large pots that are in the case just over on the far left-hand side there. A lot of objects from Cyprus, etc. So just a few close-ups of some of the cases that you have there to show just how extensive this collection was. And the vast majority of the objects, if not all of them, that you see on the left-hand side are still in Harrogate museums. Still in storage there, but fantastic objects from different Mediterranean cultures, from Greece, from Cyprus, and elsewhere. While on the right-hand side, you can see the display of some of the Egyptian antiquities, which are very much squeezed into this case. That's not to say that this was all the Egyptian stuff. We know from other photographs that it was scattered throughout the museum, but this was his main Egyptian collection that you have there, the main objects, which include stelae, as we have several down at the bottom. We've got pottery, you've got statues, you've got a piece of plaster from a New Kingdom tomb, from the ceiling, and of course we have the Anubis, which I says I wasn't going to mention again, but that's the last time, definitely. Lots and lots of pottery, in particular pre-dynastic pottery. Now, Some of you will know that we run the pottery project here at Swansea, SUP, Swansea University Pottery Project, which is a collaboration between the Egypt Centre and the department with Christian Knobla. And this is where students get to work directly on the pottery themselves. So when the Harrogate stuff arrived, we worked extensively with the pottery, and I'll be mentioning that in a little bit. We've been able to find a lot of stories about the collection since it arrived here in Swansea. And one of the most remarkable ones, I suppose, is with this Shapti on the left-hand side, belonging to Seti I. When it arrived here, we didn't know much about it. And so I started researching it further. And thanks to a manuscript that Kent produced of his collection, he tells us that he bought it in 1919 from the collection of this guy. Anybody know who this is on the right-hand side? Alan probably knows. No? This is Lord Swansea. Lord Swansea, yeah. Henry Hussey Vivian, the first Baron of Swansea, who used to live in this house, which I'm sure many of you will recognize this if you're based at Swansea. This house is only 100 meters away from here. So it used to be on display on the mantelpiece, and there's an archival photograph in the university archives where you can see it on the mantelpiece. Yet in 1919, his son sold the building along with the contents, and that's how Swansea University was formed, from the sale of a lot of that collection, etc., and given up the land, the Singleton Park that it's now called today, or part of it. So here we are, some, 100 plus years that the Shapti has returned to Swansea to go on display. So ironic, and that's something that we just never expected when the collection came here. And that's one of a number of stories that we'll be telling you about throughout the course of today. But like I say, the focus is not on Kent. Instead, it's going to be on James Roberts Ogden. So it is my great honour to introduce our colleagues who are coming down here from Harrogate. And Ben is going to talk about the collection here. So over to you. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, no, yeah, don't worry. Is that working for everyone? Yeah, good, brilliant. Okay, so this was James R. Ogden's place of work since 1910. So originally he founded the business in 1893 round the corner, and then moved here in 1910. This beautiful Edwardian premises with these lovely curved windows. And as far as possible, we've tried to keep the character, the original interior, as much as possible as well, with these ancient cabinets. And then made a nice room and a little archive upstairs where we can share some of the history of the business. So James, was born in 1866 in Leeds. To his father was a grocer in Leeds, and moved to Harrogate in about the early 1870s, mid 1870s, that sort of time. Harrogate was really booming at the time. It was becoming what was called the world's greatest spa. There are more natural springs underneath Harrogate than anywhere else on earth. It's something like 165 natural springs. And so they were able to capitalize on that. And it was open for visitors. People could take the waters and improve their health. And then lots of entertainment sprung up around that, smart hotels, and of course shops. And so James was able to, I need to go backwards, sorry, one step. That one. So yes, he was born 1866. His younger brother, Walter, was by all accounts, a talented comedian and actor. So there was a sort of slightly gregarious nature that was in the family, in both brothers. He was, James would, I think I've gone, actually, sorry, one second. I'll go backwards one. I think it's just jumped ahead a bit. Sorry. Oh, there we are, yeah, brilliant. Sorry about that. This is Coldbath Road. It's one of the sort of nice residential areas of Harrogate, actually quite similar today. And you can see all these lovely sort of Victorian and Edwardian villas. James, on his route to school, the story goes that he would walk down and all these large quarries where they were quarrying the stone to build these smart buildings. He saw things glinting out from within the quarries. And they were dubbed Harrogate diamonds. They were actually quartz, but the story goes that that sort of piqued James's interest in fine jewellery and you know, the more glittery things in life. And so he very soon, opened his first shop, the Little Diamond Shop, and that was opened in 1893, round the corner from the current business. And you can see in the windows, I mean, the balance of stock is quite different nowadays. In those days, a lot of people had table silver. They'd have quite grand displays on their dining room tables. The advent of dishwashers and everything else, I think the practicality of having large silver collections isn't really there anymore. So we do a lot less silver than we used to, but also pearls, which I will talk about in just a second. This is the first ledger on the left here. That was literally a grocery ledger. So if you turn back one page, you'll have, you know, the sale of some cucumbers to Mrs. Smith in Leeds. And then you turn over, and the very first entry on the 20th of April is a hall clock to a Smith Kelly of Norfolk. So that was the first sale. This here on the right is the very first pocket watch that the business sold. And there was quite a big business in pocket watches. And it was sold to a Mr. Bennett. And the reason we've got it back is that Mr. Bennett couldn't afford to pay for it all in one go. So he asked Mr. Ogden, obviously he was in his first week of trade and keen to sort of keep the connection with the customer. He asked if he could buy pay in installments, but take it away. And James readily agreed to that. And so Mr. Bennett came back about 2 weeks later with the next installment and was waved away by Mr. Ogden, who told him, no need to take any further money off you. You've shown it to so many people around Harrogate that we've seen a huge boom in the sale of pocket watches. And so he was let off making any further payments. Hence why it came back to us when Mr. Bennett died. The family brought it back. So it's quite a nice sort of circular story there. And business was really booming then. And so we moved to our current location, which is just, you can see the sort of larger canopy there. This is a picture from about 1911 or 12, so just after we moved in. And here is a sketch of the interior, and you can see how, you know, it's very much the same building. The scale is slightly warped. I mean, this girl is I don't think she'd be able to climb up those steps, the size of it. But yeah, it's quite a nice sort of stylized sketch. Yeah, I mean, this looks like some sort of film set. It's fantastic, with far fewer cars than these days. But yeah, business was doing very well. He opened round the corner in Harrogate. He opened a little watch shop. And then he also opened in other spa towns. He opened in Scarborough, he opened in Bath, and Llanandrod Wells in North Wales. That was all in before, well, it would have been quite early on before the First World War, so in very early days of the business. There's one sort of story that sort of captured the imagination of the press in 1911. This is the Round Britain Air Race, sponsored by the Daily Mail. And the winner was to be given a solid silver tea service by James R. Ogden. Of course, the plane landed, tea service was presented, plane couldn't take off, of course. The wait was far too great. So the tea service remained in Harrogate, and I don't think was ever collected by the winner ever since. Of course, the First World War would have come as quite a shock to the people of Harrogate, as it did to everyone else. Walter was the youngest son of James. He had 4 sons. All 4 went to war. And Walter was commanding a tank in 1917 called Harrogate. He was allowed to christen it. He was in H Battalion, hence he was allowed to christen it Harrogate. And unfortunately met his end. He was in the Battle of Cambrai, which was one of the first mass uses of tanks in battle. It went very well for the first assault, but then 10 days later, it was quite clear that tanks were getting marooned and could be shot at with field guns and penetrated with. So unfortunately, Walter was hit. It was then moved to another tank and then hit again. So died the following day. When we did a large refit of the shop in 2014, we found a huge box file of all Walter's correspondence with his parents and everything, telegrams, even the telegram order for battle, and various other things. So we've put them on a sort of permanent display in the shop. It did also mean that the other shops that James had opened had to close. So Bath, Scarborough and Llanidrod Wells closed during the war. James was very moved by the plight of the Belgian refugees coming into Great Britain. And so he offered his house. He had a large house in called Spring Glen. He offered it up for the refugees. And so he moved to a different house, kept that one, and they were able to look after them there. And he was the treasurer of the Belgian Refugee Committee. He was ordered he was offered the sort of Chevalier of Arts and Letters equivalent by the Belgian royalty after the war. Business was booming soon after the war, but obviously just the Harrogate shops at that stage. And James he felt the next move should be London. So he loitered around Mayfair in disguise here to see where the best footfall was and where people would be. And he alighted on this place here, which is in Duke Street, St James's, just around the corner from where sort of Christie's is and very near Bond Street. And so moved into there in about 1922. The sons, his three remaining sons, would take turns to look after the shop in London. And then this person here on the left is the eldest son, William. And we have in our collection a book of minutes of all the management meetings that would take place. And there's a sort of edict that went out that no one should set up in competition with the main business. Of course, a week later, William set up in opposition with a shop in just actually where Christie's is now. And that's then became Richard Ogden, which is in Burlington Arcade, and only recently left Burlington Arcade. Now, James had always been interested in ancient jewellery, particularly, but also archaeology, and he joined the Egypt Exploration Society at quite a young age. He was very much aware of what Howard Carter was trying to do in the Valley of the Kings, and he began a sort of correspondence with Lord Carnarvon and Howard Carter. He was able to be of use because not only did he have a lot of contacts, a lot of wealthy contacts who would be coming to Harrogate, and he could give lectures to raise funds for the trips, but also he could analyze metal. He was a specialist in ancient metals, and also make replicas as well, so that people could test them for viability and that sort of thing. And so this is him on the left with his porter, Taleb Osman. And he was actually in the Valley of the Kings. We have a slide of him at Tutankhamun's tomb in March 1923. So just after it was opened, he was out there. And this is him on the right with a family called the Prestons of Harrogate, who ran an antique business in Harrogate selling ancient artifacts. And so this is them on their camels. And here's just a bit of the sort of correspondence with Howard Carter and Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon. And here on the right is some of the work that he did. So he put a value on the weight of the coffin in gold, and then just sort of put that into sort of jewelry terms for Howard Carter, and then shared the information with him. Now, you've seen the mummy mask already. The sequin on the far left, these were sent up to him by the British Museum. These are sequins from the tomb of Tutankhamun, and he was asked to test it. And one thing he found was that the red hue of these gold sequins was one of the earliest occasions of rose gold that he could find, because the alloy, there was a lot of iron in the mix, and that created this sort of red color. The perfume bottle in the middle was also part of James R. Ogden's collection. Everything when he died was donated to museums, or anything of any value, certainly. And at this time, he was named as an advising goldsmith to the British Museum. So he did quite a lot of research, and the sequins were just one example, but he was also asked to value various other items and to test them. And also it was a lot of correspondence where, you know, particularly when he got into the work that was being done in modern-day Iraq, there was a lot more correspondence with the British Museum about that as well. And then this is where it all soured a bit with Howard Carter. James had been doing lectures, and he had given a lecture in Cambridge, and he was reported as saying that it was not actually Howard Carter who discovered the tomb initially. It was someone on the site. It was a young Egyptian boy who then they went to fetch Carter. He was on a different place on the site. And obviously, Howard Carter felt that slightly invalidated his claim to be, you know, the sort of lead archaeologist on the project, and he wanted a retraction. So this is a letter to Howard Carter's lawyers asking James R. Ogden to publish an apology and retract what he said. And then here, this is James turned his attention after sort of falling out with Carter to what was going on in Ur. He was absolutely fascinated with his keen sort of Methodist upbringing and his interest in biblical history. This was a really good fit in terms of, you know, the birthplace of Abraham, Jacob's ladder, the ziggurat, all of that. So this is him with Leonard Woolley here. And then to the right is someone from Harrogate, Reverend Mitchell, who was a chemist. And obviously they very useful to the work that was being done out there in testing and analyzing. One interesting story about JRO with Mitchell, they traveled by road largely, and they were set upon by bandits on their way. The press report stated that 1,000 camels were stolen. It must have been a huge trip, but also some women, which is slightly alarming. But yeah, I mean, it just gives an idea of the sort of intrepid nature of these people, that they were taking quite large risks with their lives when they traveled on these trips. And then this is some of the correspondence that we have in the shop between the Woolleys and James R. Ogden. Particularly interesting is the letters from Catherine Woolley. There is almost nothing surviving because she actually ordered that all her correspondence be destroyed when she died. It's not a memo that reached Harrogate, unfortunately. So the letters are still there. On the right is a picture. It's a terrible scan, I'm afraid, but it's a picture of Gertrude Bell with Lawrence of Arabia. And it was a picture that was given to James R. Ogden, and then it sort of found its way into various other collections. And that there on the left, the far left, is James organizing payday. He was raising huge amounts of money for this by doing lectures. And he's there with Leonard Woolley when it was time for everyone to be paid. And then this is just some of the press around James's talks that he gave. And there's a ticket to the top left of a lecture that he gave about the home of Abraham, but also the tomb of Tutankhamun. There's an article about detailing the house, James's house, described as the house of 10,000 lantern slides in the top middle of the picture. It also explains a new method that James used to sort of conserve press cuttings using, I think, some sort of wallpaper paste. I mean, it's fairly, one would imagine it's fairly obvious nowadays, but it was apparently quite novel at the time. Referring to the lectures, he had raised up to £40,000 by 1931 for these digs. So in modern terms, that's 2 million or so. So that would help each season. They would obviously need the funding to go out and do another season. And so this would be a huge help if you could give these talks and raise the money for it. And obviously, while James was pursuing these interests, the business carried on. So the sons were largely dealing with this. Pearls was a huge, in those days, pearls almost more valuable than diamonds. They would attract higher prices, certainly. A £50,000 pearl necklace acquired. The difference between these and most pearls that you will see is that these are natural pearls, so there's no nucleus at all. A cultured pearl, you induce a little bead into the oyster, and then the oyster coats that with nacre, and that becomes the cultured pearl, hence the quite spherical shape of them. These were sourced completely naturally, so you can imagine the work that would go into acquiring a necklace like this. And this one in the middle belonged to a very famous Edwardian performer, this one on the lower right, Gabby Delise. She was from Marseille. She grew up in poverty, but she made an absolute fortune. She was the Taylor Swift, really, of her day, and was a dancer and singer. And when she died, there was a huge auction in Paris where all of her items were sold to raise money for the poor in Marseille. And this was the star lot, the 3-row pearl necklace that was acquired by the firm. On the right, there were some royal commissions. This is Princess Marina with the Duke of Kent. And that was a commission of some pearls from Queen Alexandra that were inherited by the Duke and turned into this beautiful suite of platinum, diamond and pearl that was then given to Princess Marina. Another one was a diamond collet that Edward VII commissioned to give to his daughter, Princess Maud, who later became the Queen of Norway. And then on the left, for the coronation of 1937, we produced 2 replicas of the imperial state crown to go on display in the shops. And so we still have these. A lot of work, obviously some famous replicas of some very famous gems, including the Black Prince ruby, which is the large red stone, actually a spinel, but described as ruby at the time, and Cullinan, the second largest Cullinan stone at the bottom. That's a huge natural diamond. And of course, with the London shop just around the corner from Westminster Abbey and the palace, there was quite a lot of business. So this tiara here, which belonged to Napoleon, Empress Josephine's tiara, was sold by the business for someone to wear at the coronation in 1937. And then just one more sort of piece of jewelry that was of significance was Marie Antoinette's necklace that was acquired. You can see there's no necklace in the box. Sadly, I haven't managed to find a photograph of it. But that was loaned to the Goldsmiths Company of Birmingham to celebrate their anniversary. And it was in a sort of mask where they performed wearing the tiara and replaying, acting as Marie Antoinette. Among some of the more interesting commissions would have been the silver work that we did. In those days, we had 8 silversmiths in the business and did some quite eye-catching commissions, such as this sheep here at the top, which was for the Worshipful Company of Weavers. And that was, we repatriated it for just a few weeks to celebrate our 130th anniversary and brought it up to Harrogate for a bit. This is a model of the Pump Room Museum made in silver. It was a salt cellar that you saw earlier. And various other interesting items, the soup tureens that were sold to the Roosevelts when they came to London to address the Houses of Parliament. And there were obviously quite large risks with running a business that was selling such high value items. We had a lot of quite frightening armed robberies in the 30s and 40s, and also some quite unusual thefts. I mean, large sort of snatch thefts of blue diamonds and that sort of thing. Quite frightening stuff if you're running a jewelry business. But James wasn't immune from a little illegality himself, and he was arrested here for obstructing the highway with his car, and he was observed for 40 minutes. It's heartening to think that they were able to just sit observing someone who was infringing a traffic regulation in those times, but they obviously had a lot more police than we have now. And when James, in 1936, he was awarded the Freedom of Harrogate, and this is a scroll that houses the freedom. This is him here with his family of several generations in the Winter Gardens in Harrogate, which is now a Wetherspoon, but you can still see the general shape of the building. And that's really James. He died in 1940. He went on his death. He donated everything, pretty much everything he had, except for a lot of lantern slides and some of the letters. They went to the British Museum. They went to the Brotherton Library in Leeds, the Pennsylvania State Museum. And he also had a large collection of Rudyard Kipling's works, which went to the British Library as a full collection. Harrogate, by then, it never really recovered its sort of spa heyday status. And the last sort of great ceremonial affair was the Lord Mayor of London visiting in 1939 to open a large extension to the Royal Baths. But it really was the beginning of the end of the glory days of Harrogate's spa. Harrogate's found a new present, if you like, with its floral displays and its conferences. But the spa now is more of a footnote, really, than anything else, sadly. So that is the history of James. And obviously, the business has carried on, and we're now the 5th generation. But we're hugely grateful to this man because he set us all on our own ways. So we're very grateful to him. Thanks. Oh, yeah.
Thank you very much, Robert, for that. I hope that gives everybody a fantastic introduction to JRO as a person before we start to look in depth more of his collection. So of the 813 objects that arrived to the Egypt Centre last year, 171 of them have been traced back to the collection of JRO. Over the next hour or so, we're going to be presenting some of those objects. We will take a break just before the hour for 5 minutes or so that people can have a quick break, and then we'll continue again with the second part before having the exhibition at the end, the launch of that. But just to go through some of the objects that we have, this is a fantastic second intermediate period stela that was part of the collection belonging to a man called Yofne Arpeshishi, which is, I like to say it, a name that just rolls off the tongue. But it is a very typical stela of the period. Since it's arrived here in Swansea, obviously we've been able to read the inscription and the names of the people that are there, but we've also able to trace it back to the auction catalogue that it came from, and thanks to Marcel Marie at the British Museum, who has been working on these stela, who first alerted me to the fact that this was one that is found in the collection of Robert de Restafiel. Those people who have been attending my courses online will know that I like to talk about Restafiel a lot, mainly because we have around about 800 objects already in the Egypt Centre collection from this sale, including, for example, the large piece that you see at the bottom, which is on display in the House of Death gallery. But you can see the stela of Yofne Arpeshishi, number 9, as it's listed on the slide there, giving us an indication as to where these objects were coming from that Ogden was able to acquire. How exactly he acquired it, of course, is something that we don't quite know. Did he buy it directly? That doesn't seem to be the case. Here it is as number lot 71, where it's simply referred to as a figure with peshesh. That's how it was read at the time, as just part of his name was read directly above his head, rather than the beginning of his name, which is at the end of the third column, or third line, as you've got it there. So it's certainly lot number 71, and we can see that it was bought for £1 and 1 shilling, but that it was bought by a dealer called Fenton, or S.G. Fenton, who was quite a well-known London dealer at the time. So was Fenton buying it, and then Ogden potentially was going to his shop in London and acquiring it from there? We still don't know the whole kind of, I suppose, way in which this was acquired by Ogden himself. Fenton's collection was sold in 1927, so it could also be that he bought it at that stage, although it doesn't seem to be described in the auction catalogue from 1927. So exactly when he got it is difficult to say. One thing to note here, though, is that it says that it's one stela along with 3 others. That begs the question, is what happened to the other 3? They're not certainly seemingly listed in the plates, but it could be that Ogden was able to acquire all 4 of these objects. And there are a few other stelae in the collection, which I'll come on to in just a second. But looking at the inscription itself, which I've typed out here on JSESH, it's a fairly simple inscription that we've got there with the Hetepti Nesu formula, or the offering formula, addressed to the god Osiris, Lord of Jeddu, the great god, Lord of Abydos, in order that he may give a voice offering or an invocation offering. This is the typical spell that you find on, or formulas that you find on funerary stela, ensuring that the deceased is going to receive nourishment in the afterlife. In this case, we've got bread, beer, cattle, fowl, alabaster, linen, offerings and provisions, and everything good and pure. And then for the ka of, or the double of, UFNE, or peshashi, shown on the left-hand side. And just opposite him, with a table of offerings in the middle, you've got the inscription that says, born to Neferhotep, the name of his mother, on the right. Now, I mentioned that there are 3 other stela that were part of that lot, and I wonder whether any of these pieces are from the collection, or from that lot. In particular, this large piece that you see up the top. Unfortunately, they are all fakes, but that was very common at the time. We know, for example, Henry Wellcome, where the majority of the Egypt Centre objects are coming from, would often be interested in one object that was part of a lot. He would buy the entire lot, and you'd get one nice object, and then you'd end up with maybe 5 fakes. And of course, Rastafel is also very well known for its fakes. How do we tell that they're fakes? Well, in many cases, it's because the hieroglyphs just simply don't make sense. Or there's the style that you've got there indicates that it's not making much sense, or that it was produced by modern Egyptians for sale to tourists. A good example is this one down at the bottom, where you've got this kind of sphinx-like animal there with as a lion, but then you've got the Hathoric crown on top there. There's some peculiarities with the hieroglyphs as well that indicate that it doesn't, that it's not a genuine object, but it does try to imitate the cartouche of Amenhotep I, one of the well-known kings of Egyptian history, who was deified and worshipped as really the patron god of the Theban region. And it is quite interesting that this object at the bottom has the cartouche of Amenhotep I, because the large stela fragment up in the top there also has the cartouche of Amenhotep I. So there's 2 objects here trying to replicate objects that were created around 3,500 years ago. Now, this stela itself, at first hand, may look as if it's genuine, but those of you that understand hieroglyphs will see some peculiarities with it in terms of the paleography of the signs, the way in which the hieroglyphs are written, or the fact that you've got some signs that are back to front. For example, the Wab sign, which I'll try and just highlight over here. Hopefully that shows up. We've got the Wab sign written back to front, or you've got some signs that are repeated that just don't make any sense. Yes, there are parts of it that can be read as a proper text, which makes me wonder whether this particular piece was copied from an original in places. And up in the top right-hand corner, you've got one of these mud stamps, which were very typical in around about 1900, which have the cartouches of the pharaoh Seti I at the beginning of the 19th dynasty. We have one on display similar to this of Ramesses II, who is his son, and they were very well known to Egyptologists at the time that were being sold at Medina Tabu by the locals there. So that was those two of Amenhotep I. But among the collection, there are some really beautiful objects. And just let me see what the time is so I know when to stop. Move that out of the way. Time there. So these are two faience tiles on either end that come from the Ogden collection. And they're two tiles of Seti II. Now, Seti II was a ruler of the 19th dynasty, so around about 1200 BC. The tiles themselves, although they're broken and they're not from the same tile itself, they would have been similar to this one that you have in the British Museum right in the center, just to give you an idea of what a full-sized one would have looked like. And these are tiles that were well known again to early Egyptologists when they were working in Egypt and going through various sites, particularly associated with palaces, or several which come from the site of Karnak, where they were inserted into the doorways, particularly leading to the 8th pylon at Karnak. So it's possible that these are coming from the site of Karnak, although we can never say with any great certainty. They're made out of faience, faience being this man-made material which the Egyptians were using from the pre-dynastic period, so from around 3500 or so BC. It's basically made of a quartz which is crushed up, mixed with plant ash, a bit of water, and natron to create this paste-like material, which they can mold into any object that they desire. In this case, we've got one that is nicely, they've used two different colors here to highlight the inscriptions that you've got on it. Unsurprisingly, there is some jewelry in the collection. There were at least 6 necklaces that were presented to Harrogate Museum in the 1930s, and we've got a ledger which gives a description of the objects that were presented at this time. This is just 2 of the pieces that I'm going to show today, both of which, according to the ledger, are coming from the site of Tuna El Gebel. Now, Tuna El Gebel is in Middle Egypt. What we don't know at this stage is what reason there is to suggest that they're coming from the site of Tuna El Gebel. Were they given to Ogden by an excavator, for example? Were they purchased from him or by him during his visits to Egypt, perhaps at the site of Tuna El Gebel? We just don't know. But the piece on the left-hand side is on display in the new exhibition, which you'll be able to see a little bit later, or at least those of you that are in person will be able to see it. In terms of metals, this is the only metallic object that we have from, I think, the Ogden collection. This is a small head of a cat, but it's a really beautiful piece, as you can see there. Now, the star probably of the collection, which Robert showed earlier, is the mask. This funerary mask that dates to the Roman period. It's made out of cartonnage. Cartonnage is the Egyptians' equivalent, really, of a paper mache in a way, made out of bandages or strips of linen, which are glued together with a gum or a resin to make them hard, or to stiffen them, and then you'd have a layer of plaster on top of that, followed by a layer of paint. In many cases, these masks, and we've got several on display in the Egypt Center, will have gilded faces, because the Egyptians believed that the faces of the gods was, or the skin of the gods was of gold, their hair of lapis lazuli, which is this blue color, and then their bones was of silver. With this mask itself, you'll also see that you've got some inlays for the eyes and eyebrows, which are made out of glass, with some nice decoration also on the front of it, representing the 4 sons of Horus who protect the internal organs. We know from the records that this was presented by a man called Sir Henry Sutcliffe Smith. And I was doing a little bit of research about him last night. He's from a place called Markeaton, which I'd never heard of before, but just near Harrogate. And Sutcliffe Smith worked at Bradford Textile Industry and was the executive director for Bradford Dyes Association. So he must have known that JRO had a collection of Egyptian antiquities and presented it to his collection. So it's always good to learn a little bit about the history as to where these objects are coming from. Tracing it back further, unfortunately, we can't at this stage know where Sutcliffe Smith received it. I'll do a couple more. I'll do the scarabs and then we'll take a 5-minute break. But unsurprisingly, a lot of the objects which are in the collection are quite small, that would be very fitting for a jeweler. And that includes some fantastic scarabs. As many of you will know, the scarab beetle or the dung beetle is one that the Egyptians will use a lot in objects. They're not the beetles that go under your skin as they do in the mummy. That's, of course, all make-believe. But for the ancient Egyptian, the scarab beetle was the symbol of resurrection. They saw the scarabs, or the dung beetles laying their eggs inside the dung, and then the little scarabs emerging from it as new life. And so for them, it was the symbol of resurrection. But at the same time, producing small scarabs out of faience or glazed steatite, as it is in most cases, allowed them to really produce miniature objects that often had detailed inscriptions or scenes on them. This one, for example, has on the left-hand side, has the cartouche Neb Ma'at Re, which is the name of Amenhotep III. Amenhotep III, who ruled around about 1350 BC. And you can see from the scale just how small these objects are. You're talking less than 2 centimeters. And these are on display upstairs in the new temporary exhibition case. While on the right-hand side, we have this scarab, which has a representation of the Egyptian god Bes. Bes, who's well known as a god of partying and having a good time. But just to show you a few of the other scarabs that we have there, and there are around about 20 or so in the collection from the Ogden collection. We only put a small selection of them on display, but here's just 6 that we do have. And they range from ones dating to the Middle Kingdom or Second Intermediate Period. Up in the top left-hand corner there, you've got some really nice hieroglyphs, etc. on there. The one in the bottom left, where you've got these swirls, are very typical of the Second Intermediate Period as well. While others will have inscriptions on there, which are often wishes for the deceased in a way, or good wishes for the person who is wearing it. Scarabs in a way can also act as seals. So they were multifunctional in a way. They're often there as a seal. If you're sealing a document or vessels within temples, you would often have the person who is sealing that to make sure that the contents are still intact. This one down on the lower right-hand side contains the cartouche of Menkaure, Menkaure being Tutmosis III, who was a ruler around about 1400 BC. So again, it's not too surprising that you do have really beautiful scarabs in the collection of Ogden, given his association with jewelry. And the last slide before we take a break is this scaraboid of Hatshepsut. Now, Hatshepsut was a female ruler, again, around about 1400 BC, one of the few Egyptian rulers of Egyptian history. This scaraboid that we have in the collection, and it is on display, is double-sided, and up in the top, you can see you've got the Sphinx, which is holding a large pyramidal shape, which is just a cone of cake. But the hieroglyphs above her head give the name Ma'at Kare. That's one of the names of Hatshepsut. While down at the bottom, you have this baboon, and directly above, you've got the cartouche given, again, the name Ma'at Kare. That is the throne name of Hatshepsut, this well-known pharaoh. Again, where Ogden got these objects from is difficult to know. Obviously, we've already heard about his close association with Howard Carter. Howard Carter worked at the site of Deir el-Bahri, which is where you have the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut. So it could also be that some of these objects were gifted to Howard Carter by Howard Carter to JRO for the work that he was doing. And maybe, Robert, you know if there's more in the archives suggesting that that was the case. Yeah, it would be interesting to know. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Hopefully you can hear me on Zoom. If you can give a thumbs up to Sam, who's monitoring the chat there. Or a yes. Yep, they can hear. That's good. So I hope you've enjoyed the first part of the session today. We're now going to go back into the second part, looking at more of the objects of the Ogden collection. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our collections access manager, Meg Gundlach, who's going to be talking about the Shaptis from the collection.
Hello, everyone. So as Ken said, oops, hold on. All right. As Ken said, I'm going to give you a really brief kind of overview of the Shaptis you'll be seeing in the exhibit today. I am going to keep it brief, both because we have a lot to cover and also because I'm very quickly losing my voice. So if you need to take a quick tea break, please forgive me. As most of you probably know, I am a Shapti enthusiast, and I never pass up the opportunity to talk about some of our ancient friends with you. So move on. Hopefully this will switch slides. Maybe. There we go. All right. So there's 6 Shaptis included in the highlights exhibition. Harrogate actually has 17 that were gifted from Ogden, and you can see them arranged here chronologically. That there are no Middle Kingdom or Second Intermediate Period examples isn't particularly surprising. In those periods, they made so few per owner that statistically there's just a lot less of them. What I do find kind of surprising is that there are no kind of tourist art Victorian pseudo Shaptis. These tend to infest donate collections of this time period. And the fact that there are none is surprising, not only because of that, but also because, as Ken pointed out, we actually do know there are several other fake items in that collection. And then at the top, you can see there's 3 Shaptis just kind of hanging out. These styles are so ubiquitous that without kind of more contextual information, it can be really hard to date them securely. Working through those that are in the exhibition, the first example actually has the least for us to discuss. In the New Kingdom, it was quite common to carve the body of the Shapti, but add even really elaborate implements or adornments in paint. As you can see here, we have the remains of black, red, and yellow paint, but there's very little detail remaining. It is, however, really nicely sculpted. And as you can see from the better preserved painted limestone examples in the British Museum, it likely would have been quite striking. Moving into the Third Intermediate Period, we of course start with Penedjem II. So interestingly, this is the only broken Shapti in the Ogden collection. But I think that the dignitary himself more than makes up for his missing feet. So Penedjem II was one of the most prominent members of the 21st dynasty high priest of Amun. They were the de facto rulers of Upper Egypt during that time. Though he was discovered buried with dozens of other royal persons in TT 320, it's likely that the tomb was actually intended for his own burial. So you can see in the map on the upper right-hand side why it was chosen for a royal cache. It's tucked around the cliffs of Deir el-Bahri and quite hard to get access to. Though the coffins and the bodies that were found there were retained by Egypt and can now be visited in the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization, the smaller burial goods flooded the art market almost immediately. There's 150 known Shaptis of Penedjem II that are now dispersed worldwide. And for the Shapti scholars amongst you, you might be interested to know that the term U-Shapti actually comes into use first with the figures of Penedjem II. But as Glenn James has highlighted, many of the Shaptis of Penedjem II, including the example we have here, don't write the T element of the word U-Shapti. And just for clarity, I'm going to keep calling them Shaptis for the rest of the discussion because it gets too complicated to switch back and forth. Next up, we have the god's father, Ramun, Pediamun. These are interesting because there's actually very few known parallels. But we already had an overseer example here at the Egypt Center. So you can see him on the right-hand side there. The parallels are often attributed to coming from the second royal cache of Baba Gassus. And while there are multiple Pediamuns known from this burial, they all have different titles, and stylistically, they're quite different from this one. To be honest, if I was to assume that this had come from there, I'd think there'd be a lot more examples available in collections now. So for now, this Pediamun remains a bit of a mystery. Our remaining three figures all come from the late period. Here you see Hornacht, born of Nefertiti. While in form, he's thoroughly typical example of the late period. He's notable, this one particularly, is notable for his general disregard for spatial organization, particularly when it comes to his text. So for one thing, if you look closely at the side of the figure, the right side. Sorry, I need the mouse. I know, I need it on my screen. How do I get it on my screen? No. Hello. Sorry, bear with me 1 minute. The microphone is over my notes.
Oh. Not showing up, is it? Oh, there it is. Yeah. Do you want that moved?
Yes, please.
Hopefully. Right. Okay. It's over there now. You've got the
Great.
hieroglyphs up, by the way. I've been forward.
No. There we go. Right. So for one thing, if we look closely at the right side of the figure, we can see that the end of nearly every row of the inscription kind of bleeds onto the side of the back pillar. But the opposing side, the other surface of the back pillar, is never used at the start of a row. So that kind of indicates they start with the best of intentions, and then they run out of room, and they have to keep going into the space. It isn't unusual to use the back pillar for an inscription. It's often used to reiterate the names and titles of the owner. But in the case of Hornacht, it seems to be used mostly for corrections. Now hopefully we can get back to the one that has the hieroglyphs. There we go. Okay, so here our spell starts on the back pillar with the term Jed Medu, and then continues from right to left through the first row. Below that, we see the Osiris, which should be at the end of row 2 or at the start of row 3, which is where Hornacht's actual name appears. After that, we jump down to line 7. We have a pair of owls squeezed in towards the bottom there. And I think it's interesting that they chose to use the 2 owl combination, because there is an alternative spelling of MM that takes up probably half the space or less, but they went for the full version. And then below that, we see an R, and then followed what looks to be an Ankh, but should actually be the sign R15, which is the ideogram for east. And then, yeah. And then the final signs of the inscription, I think you can see on the frontal view, even in our images here. The last couple signs of the inscription actually appear on the top of his feet. So to attribute this to corrections rather than an intentional use of the space, even a slightly unusual use of the space, I turn to the other known examples. So if we consider our 4 Hornachts that you see here, one is covered with a wood support, so that doesn't really help us in any way. The other partial fragment actually has no inscription at all in what remains of the back pillar. While there is, unfortunately, no picture of the back from Aji, the transcription of the first line, which you can just about see at the bottom, just really gives no indication that the text was divided in any way at that point. And then if we look at the other complete example that we know of from the British Museum here, it shows a completely different use of this space. So on here, the first 4 characters appear on the back pillar, but the Medu sign, which should have started out the entire text, seems to have been replaced by the solar symbol from the word Sahej, which is essentially the 3rd word of the inscription, and appears correctly in its place there as well. And again, while there's no other signs that appear on the back pillar for that example, they do use the top of the foot for the final signs. The burial of Hornacht, born of Nefertiti, is unknown, but it's likely from the Memphis or Saqqara region. All right, so next up, we have Samtek Min, born of Netakrit. So while Samtek Min here has the same back pillar and plinth that we saw in Hornacht, you can see there's considerably less text to consider. The front records the name of himself and his mother, and the back has a very abbreviated version of the Shapti spell. While there's only one Samtek Min that you'll be seeing today in the exhibit, there's actually 2 of them from the Ogden collection, which is the only Shapti that he duplicates at any point. Another's in the Petrie Museum, and 2 more are in Manchester. And one of the ones in Manchester was donated by a man called W. Sharp Ogden. So I did look into this a little bit, and I'd like to hear if you've ever heard of this man himself. But he seems to have been a pretty well-known architect and antiquarian. And I found lots and lots of biographies about him. Obviously, he's from the Manchester region, so same area of the world. But I've never found anything that specifically links him to the Ogdens of Harrogate or overlapping family members. And finally, I present to you Jed Hare, born of Irteru. While there's only one Jed Hare in the Ogden collection, there's actually 3 of them in Harrogate. The other 2 come from the Kent collection, which Ken has already addressed. And it's reasonable to assume that all 3 of them made their way to North Yorkshire together and then were respectively purchased. Jed Hare's burial is also unknown, but a label on one of the Kent Shaptis suggests it was in the possession of a Professor Lanzoni in 1842. This character is increasingly problematic for our studies, as the only Professor Lanzoni ever known to have worked in Egypt would have been about 7 in 1842. And so that doesn't really help us in our quest for a find spot or perhaps where these were being excavated. So just a real whistle-stop tour there of the Shaptis you'll be seeing today. For those of you who are here in person, I hope you enjoy going to meet them after this. And for those of you online, I hope you enjoyed hearing a little bit more about the journey that they've taken to Swansea.
Thank you very much, Meg, for that. Shaptis, of course, are an object that I think many people here really enjoy, apart from Christian, maybe. But yeah, they're a wonderful object, and they do tell us often details that are not known. They can often be the only piece of funerary equipment known, which makes them particularly special. But moving on to some of the other objects that we have in the Ogden collection. Before the break, I talked about the small scarab figures. We're also fortunate that we have a lot of amulets, which again are really tiny. The 2 that are shown on the screen here are 2 triad amulets, in which you've got the triad of the god Horus in the center, or Horus the child in the center, flanked by Isis and Nephthys on either end. And these are amulets that are not so typical, I suppose, of Egyptian funerary culture, but there are ones that are known elsewhere, including in the British Museum. One thing to note, though, is on the back of these that have got the number O followed by 61 and 62. These were numbers that were added by Harrogate Museum to mark them as part of the Ogden collection, and they correlate with the list that was produced of the Ogden objects. So they've been very useful in helping to identify which objects in the collection originated from the Ogden collection. And just to show you 8 other ones that we have, unsurprisingly, there's a lot relating to the gods and goddesses of Egyptian history. Of course, the Egyptians did have hundreds of gods in their pantheon, so I've chosen one of each here. There are a few that are duplicated. So up in the top left, you have the goddess Nephthys. On the top row, you have a falcon-headed god with a double crown. Could be a representation of the god Horus, most likely. And you can see that they all have suspension loops so that they could have been worn or sewn into the bandages and used in the mummification process. Next to the falcon-headed deity, you have the god Bes. We've already seen a scarab of Bes a little bit earlier with his very tall plumes. And I think there were 3 Bes amulets as part of the Ogden collection. In some cases, we have nicer ones that we weren't able to put on display. The reason being that, as you'll see when you see the exhibition upstairs, we have them strung up so that they're hanging quite nicely. But in some cases, the loops at the back were broken, which meant that we couldn't string them and put them on display, or the hole was completely filled that you couldn't put a string through it anymore. So these are some nice ones that we do have. Up in the top right, you've got the goddess Tawaret, who's often seen as a protector of pregnant women as well as children, as a hippopotamus there with her large belly. And then from the bottom row, we have Thoth, the ibis-headed god of writing and wisdom. Next to him, a small amulet of the jackal-headed god Anubis. And then we have another falcon-headed deity. This time he has a sun disk on top of his head. And in many cases, of course, these are amulets that are void of any inscriptions. So it's difficult to say precisely who these deities might be. In all likelihood, it could be Reharakti, a form of the sun god. But of course, Horus can also be shown with the sun disk on top of his head. And then the final one on there has Isis, who is nursing her young son, Horus. Very typical iconography that you get of the Greco-Roman period. In the case with amulets, they're extremely difficult to date without context. So all we can really say is that the majority of these are probably dating to the 1st millennium BC, rather than giving it a very precise date. One, I think, really spectacular amulet in the collection is this lapis lazuli figure of Isis. With the previous ones that I've just shown, they're all made out of faience, so it's very easy to mold them into shape. With this one being made out of lapis lazuli, that has to be hand carved. It's made out of a stone, a semi-precious stone, which is largely coming from Afghanistan. So it gives an indication as to the various trade routes that the Egyptians had in terms of bringing this stone, not necessarily going there themselves, but through various trade networks, acquiring the stone, which could then be used for various objects, such as this beautiful figurine or amulet of the goddess Isis. Those are the ones of the gods. There are also ones that relate to specific symbols. So, for example, on the left-hand side, there are 2 jed pillars, jed pillar being the backbone of the god Osiris, which is the symbol of stability and strength. And I think there are 4, maybe 5 jed pillars in the Ogden collection, and likewise a similar number for Wadjet eyes, which we have there on the right-hand side. The one at the top is made out of faience, but the one at the bottom is really beautiful and made out of this banded agate that you've got there. So that one's made out of stone at the bottom, which has to, of course, be carved as opposed to molded. We are very fortunate that during the cataloguing process, we had Erska Furlan, who is a former PhD student here at Swansea, who was studying the subject of amulets during the 1st millennium BC, particularly from the Delta. So although she doesn't have an amulet in her hand there, because I didn't take any photographs of her with the amulets, that is Erska working on objects and cataloguing them as part of the collection, putting them directly into the online catalogue. But she worked to catalogue all the 170 odd amulets that we have from the Harrogate loan. So it was good to have that expertise here in Swansea working on those particular pieces. Perhaps the object that's gained the most excitement, I would say, of the objects here in Harrogate is this ostracon. It's an ostracon belonging to a scribe called Nakdamun, quite a well-known scribe who lived during the reign of Ramesses II. So around about 1250 BC or so. Now, ostraca are often made out of limestone chips or of pottery, where the ancient Egyptians would write letters to each other, or laundry lists, or various other things like that. And this one is a letter which is written by Nakdamun. In fact, when we received this object, because I can't read Hieratic, which is the, I suppose, the shorthand version of Egyptian hieroglyphs, I sent it to Rob de Marie in the Netherlands, who's one of the leading experts on hieratic inscriptions coming from the village of Deir el Medina. Now, at this stage, we didn't know if it was from the village of Deir el Medina, but it seemed a good bet. Now, Deir el Medina is the workmen's village that was built to house the workmen responsible for carving the tombs in the Valley of the Kings. And they lived there for around 500 years. We're a very literate society compared to most of ancient Egypt. Rob de Marie replied to me that evening, very excited that I'd sent it to him, because he said some Egyptian students had sent him a photograph of it while it was on display in a museum in England, without specifying which museum. And he had been trying to find this ostracon for 3 or 4 years, writing to various different museums trying to find it, hadn't realized that Harrogate had a collection, so didn't try Harrogate. And so after I sent him it, he was able to read it properly and say that it contains this. So this is his transcription. The article itself was just published a few months ago, so it's the first object from the Harrogate collection to be published since it's been here in Swansea. And it says, from the draftsman Nakdamun to Kai and Baki, that's his brothers. Draftsman Nebre, their father, cannot sleep. Well, let someone look for some fresh goose fat and let it be brought at once. Please go to the woman who knows about deaths. She's often referred to as the wise woman in Egyptian texts. May my mother or my father come out because of this. It is the bow which is within him at this moment. And the bow is quite a difficult word to translate in this context, but it seems to be almost like some kind of spirit which is inside the body that they're trying to remove from him to eradicate this illness. And then the letter finishes. So you assume that the goose fat was delivered and they all lived happily ever after. But then, thanks to Rob de Marie, he was able to find a second ostracon, which is in Berlin. And that ostracon was written the following day. And it says to Kai, please let there be brought some goose fat directly, very, very quickly, because the cat has eaten that which was brought yesterday. And it's just fantastic that these ostraca can give us a little bit of an insight into the life at Deir el Medina over 3,000 years ago. So if you ever have some goose fat, hide it away from the cats. And these are the stories that we've been able to tell since the collection came here to Swansea. And likewise, we have several pieces of papyrus that came to us. The papyrus itself is attached to backing board, a kind of a thin cardboard. And this one is also written in Hieratic. So I sent these to Andrea Kucharek, who's a scholar in Germany. And I should point out as well that although the collection here is in Swansea, it's not exclusively for us. We're very much of the opinion that this should be a collection for everybody. So I've been contacting various scholars, the experts in their field, so that they can make this material more known and work on it. The first thing Andrea said is that there's a bit of a problem in that the papyrus bit in the lower left-hand corner is upside down. So she's photoshopped it and it should be rotated 180 degrees, but it joins in that same location. It was just upside down. We don't know who attached it at this point, unfortunately, but Andrea was able to read the names of the owners who are mentioned on here, including identifying this as part of chapter 1 of the Book of the Dead, the well-known funerary text that we have from ancient Egypt. There were other pieces of papyri. Again, these are only really fragments that we've got here. The one on the left is obviously much larger, and it's written in some very neat hieroglyphs that you've got there. But it dates to the Ptolemaic period. Unsurprisingly, it's not written in Hieratic or even Demotic at this stage, but in nice Egyptian hieroglyphs. She's extremely excited by this and is going to be publishing it at some point soon. She says it's the only the second copy of a text which is otherwise exclusively known from a papyrus, one papyrus, as part of a Book of the Dead related papyrus. So it's extremely rare and really interesting that we have it here. While on the right-hand side, we have these two scraps of a Book of the Dead papyrus, likely dating to the New Kingdom, although it could even be Third Intermediate period. Unfortunately, there's not enough here to give us the names of the individuals who initially owned these objects. We have objects associated with beauty. These two pieces are on display in the exhibition. So on the left-hand side, we have this kohl pot or eye makeup pot, very common, of course, from ancient Egypt, from all periods of Egyptian history. But stylistically, of course, these can often be dated. And this one is probably Second Intermediate period, gone through to the early New Kingdom. So around about 1800 through to about 1400 or so BC. It still contains some of the kohl inside it there as well. So there's the potential that this could be analysed. And a lot of these kohl containers have been analysed by scholars in previous years. While on the right-hand side, we have this copper alloy mirror. Unfortunately, there's no context as to where this is coming from. Is it an Egyptian mirror? Is it Roman? Is it even coming from Mesopotamia? We don't know. So it's a little bit of a mystery here. And if anybody either joining us in person or online are experts on mirrors, do please get in touch. There are several coffin fragments in the collection, but they are quite small, as you can see here. The one on the right-hand side is probably the lid or part of a lid from an anthropomorphic coffin dating to the Third Intermediate period, around 1000 BC. While the one on the left is much later, probably Ptolemaic Roman in date, and it contains some wishes there for the deceased. But the most exciting of the coffin fragments that we received is this piece. It may not look like it. In fact, it looks quite grotty. It's difficult to see the inscription, but I'll tell the story that Meg kind of hates me telling in a way, that it was 5 to 4 on a Friday afternoon, and we usually finish at 4 o'clock. And I was looking at this piece, trying to see if I could work out any of the hieroglyphs. And I said to Meg, I'm just going to quickly get something from the store. And she was like, don't do it. Don't do it. And I went into the store and went to one of the Egypt Center objects that we have from the Wellcome collection to compare it to the piece that we have from Harrogate. And not only does it compare very well, but it actually joins directly. So an Egypt Center piece at the top joins directly with the piece from Harrogate. We could never have imagined that this was the case before the collection came here. The piece at the top always frustrated me because we had partial names. We didn't have the complete names in some cases. So we didn't know who this piece belonged to. Now we know that it belongs to a man called Osiris Mes, born of, or son of, Horian Tabit. And then the name at the end, the mother's name on the final column, if I hover over here, I don't think it's going to show on both, but the name on the top left-hand side has the name of Shepen Henutaneb, or at least that's what it appears to be on the inscription here. So it's nice that we've been able to reveal these names of the ancient Egyptians who owned them. And as the expression goes, and as we called the first Harrogate exhibition, causing their name to live. That's the whole purpose of research in this collection, to be able to read the names of the individuals who initially owned them. And likewise, the same could be said for this piece. And at this point, I was hoping to introduce John Rogers, who is one of our PhD students, who's just written an article on this particular piece. But John has to submit his PhD thesis on Monday. So we've told him that he shouldn't be coming today because he's under pressure. So John, I hope you're not joining us on Zoom today. You should be working away. But this canopic jar head depicts the baboon-headed god Hapi, one of the 4 sons of Horus. And the canopic jars, of course, were used for containing the internal organs. This one comes from the Ogden collection and still has a sticker underneath it. I think it's Ogden number 154 or 157. And this is another piece that I was looking at and thinking, well, the travertine stone that you've got here and the nice kind of color of it is very similar to one of the vessels that we have in the store from the Harrogate collection, both in terms of the size, etc. as well. And it's this jar, this beautiful jar, belonging to Jed Amun Uafank, son of Ankh-Mut and Tas-Semtek. The name Tas-Semtek is quite rare. There's only a few people who actually have this during the late period, and this object itself dates to the 26th dynasty, most likely, so around 664 to 525 BC. The lid fits perfectly on top of it, but the slight issue is that this object is not from the Ogden collection, but from the Kent collection. So was this potentially something that was mixed up at Harrogate, or is there a possibility that perhaps this object was purchased by one of the dealers, such as the Prestons, which Robert mentioned earlier, that maybe the head was bought by Ogden and the base, the jar itself, was bought by Kent? Did they know that they had each a piece of the same object? Very hard to say. But John Rogers has been researching this canopic jar since his research is on 26th dynasty individuals, and found this jar on the right-hand side, which is now in Vienna Museum. You can see this lid is still intact. And if you compare the lids in terms of the squat features and the size of them, they're pretty much identical. So I think there's no doubt that the lid that we have from the Ogden collection does belong with the jar from the Kent collection. It's just fortunate that they were actually deposited in Harrogate in the same collection. So going back to the jar again, and there you can see it with the head now on top of it. So only the head itself is on display, but the measurements of the stopper, the height of the head, it's all identical to the one which is in Vienna. I was going to introduce Meg at this point. I can skip that now. Since we rearrange things. That's the Egyptian stuff. What we also have, though, is objects coming from ancient Mesopotamia. We already had Robert talk about the various work that JRO was doing out at the site of Ur, and the fundraising, enormous amounts of fundraising. It's just unbelievable that he was able to raise 40,000 back in those days. Along with the Egyptian collection that arrived here, we also received around about 40 to 50 cuneiform tablets. Unfortunately, we don't have the expertise here in Swansea to read the cuneiform tablets, so I've been contacting various people outside of Swansea in order to really better understand these. But the notes that came with the Harrogate collection do identify some of the rulers who were involved. They include small ones, such as this one on the lower left-hand side, to much larger ones up in the right-hand side there. We've even got some early post. On the left-hand side is an envelope, which would have contained one of these clay tablets. The tablet itself is no longer inside it. It was removed. Of course, the envelope was broken and then put back together again, but it would have contained a letter such as this one on the right-hand side, written in cuneiform of different periods of Egyptian history. Cuneiform, which to some people is one of the earliest languages, certainly it is one of the earliest languages in the ancient world. And we've got examples from all periods of Mesopotamian history. Some stamp bricks, such as the one on the right-hand side, contains the name of Nebuchadnezzar II, one of the great rulers of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And there are several cylinder seals. And down at the bottom, you've got the impressions of these seals itself. The one on the far right-hand side is on display in the Ogden collection upstairs in the House of Life, which we'll go to in a little bit. We have a dedicatory cone, as they're often referred to. Now, these cones themselves are clay-shaped objects which were used by the ancient Mesopotamians to mark the ownership of certain buildings. They're inscribed with cuneiform, as you can see here, and often baked hard before they were pressed in the mud brick walls. They were often referred to as clay nails or foundation pegs, and they functioned as a symbolic dedication plaque for particular buildings. This one isn't complete. We're obviously missing the upper part, as the photo would show it here. And then several pottery vessels that we have from these ones apparently from the site of Ur. that are coming. So were they given by Woolley to JRO, again, as an appreciation for his work that he was doing at the site, or was he purchasing them during his travels? Certainly with some of the cuneiform tablets, we know from the notes that he was purchasing them from Baghdad rather than getting them direct from the excavation itself. Both of these pieces are now on display in the exhibition upstairs. I mentioned the pottery project a little bit earlier, and although the photograph that you see here is not an Ogden piece, the objects that we did have from Harrogate, the pottery objects, were all examined by our students at Swansea University as part of the Swansea University Pottery Project, which I mentioned earlier. Fantastic collaboration between the Egypt Centre and the academic department, but also ensuring that the students get this hands-on training, which you don't always get at other universities at Swansea. One of the real, I suppose, highlights that we have here at Swansea, and one of the real strengths. The idea behind having this collection in Swansea was to also make it accessible as much as possible. Yes, there was a small collection of Egyptian antiquities on display in Harrogate, but the vast majority were in storage and not known. There was no online catalogue, so one of the tasks that we had was to put all 813 objects that arrived from Harrogate onto a new online catalogue. That included with new photography. So there are around about 4,000 photographs of the collection, which are now on this new online catalogue, which is hosted by Abbaset Collections, the same platform that the Egypt Centre collection is on, which allows us to instantaneously update the records at the same time, but also to produce trails, something that we'll come on to in a bit. Sam will no doubt be posting the link into the chat to the Harrogate collection for those that are joining us online. You can explore about the collection itself, about the project, the various collectors, and explore the trails that we've got there. As I said, all objects are on there. So these are the first 15 objects that appear if you do a search for Ogden. So some of the objects we've already looked at today, but a few additional ones. And for this particular exhibition, we've produced a little booklet on the Ogden collection, which includes 30 highlights from the collection. So everybody that's here in person should have a copy of it. If you haven't, there's plenty at the door. If you're joining us online, Sam is going to be posting a PDF into the link where you'll be able to download a copy of this booklet and have a read through it. Get to know more about the objects themselves. We produced a trail on those 30 objects, which you can also access via the online catalogue. And likewise, Sam will be posting a link into the chat for that. It doesn't give you all 51 of the objects which are on display in the case upstairs, but instead just the selection of 30 of them, which is very difficult to choose because there are some really beautiful pieces. So I'm going to finish now and just to thank lots of people, really, North Yorkshire Council for, of course, allowing this collection to come to Swansea and to be researched. Harrogate Museum's staff and volunteers for working with us over the last 2 years and being absolutely fantastic. We can't thank them enough for being so accommodating with all of the material that we've got here at Swansea. The Ogden of Harrogate and the Ogden family, and it's a great pleasure to have the three of you here today, and especially with Robert to give the presentation on the Ogden family. It's just fantastic to hear that experience, and 5 generations later, I'm sure JRO would be so proud of the fact that you're standing here talking about his collection and the legacy, and it's all about his legacy, which, as you can see from the back page of the booklet that I produced, causing his name to live, and it's his good name that you should remember. It's not just about the objects, it's about the people who own these objects, which is important. To Sam Powell and the Abbaset Collections for the hosting of this platform that houses the collection. Katie Greenhalgh and Gary Lawson, who produced the 10 or 11 videos based around the collection when they initially came here to Swansea last year, so from this film production. Of course, the Egypt Centre staff and volunteers, the Swansea University Pottery Project, as well as the staff, particularly Christian, who's here today, and various external experts who have been working on the collection, such as Rob De Marie that I mentioned earlier, Marcel Murray at the British Museum, Andrea Kukarek, and others who we've been in touch with. So thank you very much to everybody who has joined us, both in person and online. We'll do about 15 minutes of questions if we have any. And then what I'm going to do is take my phone upstairs and give those people who are online a 5-10 minute view of the exhibition before those people that are in person can come up and see it. Those that are here in person will be able to help themselves to drinks and nibbles that we have as well. So does anybody have any questions in the audience for any of our speakers here? Dulcie? I'm just going to repeat the question as well for those that are on Zoom. So the question from Dulcie was, how much did... Yeah, so how much did the current Ogden family know about the collection before getting involved in the project and it coming here to Swansea?
Well, we knew obviously about the history of the business and James R. Ogden and the slides. The slides seem to have been sort of filleted a bit by various generations of the family for the ones, certainly the Tutankhamun ones, which are the sort of, I suppose, the glittering ones that people wanted to pull out first. But yeah, in terms of the collection, a lot of it, because a lot of it was in storage, we really only, I mean, I was only really aware of the ones that were on display in the last 20 years or so. But I know they've been on display for some time before that. But yeah, I wasn't wholly aware of the size of the collection and the breadth of it. It was very much the slides and the letters that we were sort of aware of.
And I think some of the objects you just seen in storage today from Harrogate when we had a quick tour around. Sam? So a question from Sam is, did Carter get his apology?
Yeah, I'm afraid that there wasn't a huge fight or anything. It's no, James R. Ogden was fairly non-confrontational, I think. He definitely felt in that relationship he was the junior partner, and he issued the apology and got it published as requested at his own expense. Although the story has, as you say, the story has stuck around, and yeah, I mean, a lot of people will affirm that probably is what happened, but it wasn't a spin that Carter wanted. So okay. He wasn't easy by all accounts. Yeah.
So it was just a comment that we had here that Carter was a very unpleasant man, which I think a lot of people have heard about. Any other questions in the audience here? We got any online? If anybody has any questions online, do please post into the chat and Sam will read them out. I'm just going to check in case any have come through to me directly rather than to you, Sam.
Yeah, no.
Yep.
I guess you've worked with quite a few different collectors now, and I was really struck with the quality of the shabties that you showed me.
Yeah. I think she's gone into her office to cough, probably. All right.
So I was just wondering about, like, you know, him as a collector, Ogden as a collector, and the types of things that he was collecting. You know, he seems to have been had a very good eye.
Yep. Yeah. So a question here is just about the various objects that were collected by Ogden, that they all seem to be really high quality stuff. And I think this is the case not just with Ogden about him having a good eye, but the same with Kent. Stuff that came here, very little of it is broken. It's intact pottery, it's intact objects, stela, etc. These are fantastic objects, and it seems to me And I can't quite prove it with the Ogden side of things, because we don't know where he was getting a lot of his objects. But certainly in the case of Kent, Kent doesn't seem to be going to the auctions directly, but is buying it through dealers. And instead of buying a lot of 5 objects that may have 1 good object and 4 broken objects, he's going directly to the dealer who bought it and then getting that 1 object, which is the real highlight. And this could well be the case with Ogden, such as the Stela of UFNE Erpishishi. And the Shaptis are really spectacular as well. Yeah, and to have a Penajim, the second one, yeah.
Bought, of course, by accident in a sense,
Mhm.
lots of good stuff. But I remember when the Wellcome collection first came to Swansea, there was a fair amount of sifting out of forgeries. His eye was not as good as Mr. Ogden's, I think.
Yeah, so a comment here about just on the opposite side of the scale, you've got Wellcome material, and Wellcome ended up with a lot of fakes. So his eye is perhaps not as good as Ogden and Kent. You could also say, I mean, Wellcome never really attended many of the auctions himself. He was sending middlemen, and in some cases he was even sending the cleaners, because he didn't want to alarm the auctioneers that you had somebody with Wellcome money who was there buying objects. It was a bit like JRO going under disguise trying to find a nice place. So they were clearly doing this at the time, and that ended up that Wellcome ended up with so many fakes, a lot of which are in the Egypt Centre collection. And a lot trace back to the Rastafel collection. Anything else? Yeah, Kristen?
Fundraising for the EEF?
Was he fundraising for the EEF, or was it just for the exhibition?
I think it was both.
It was both?
I think he was fundraising for the Egypt work as well.
Yeah.
But certainly when it was it was the I think it was the British Museum and Pennsylvania State University were combining and funding that.
Yeah.
Raising money for them.
Yeah.
Also
So
the Woolley.
yeah, so that was just a question about who was he funding for? Was it the EEF as it was, now the EES? Do you remember which year they changed, Alan? No, 1920s was it, or was it even earlier than that? 1920s, or was it earlier? Don't remember. Yeah, it used to be the Egypt, I was going to say electronic, the Egypt Exploration Fund, and then the Egypt Exploration Society as it is now. And you'd mentioned certainly that he was a member of the EES, so he could well have been doing funding for them, and then from the excavations more prominently at Ur.
The next question was, are there any traces of objects that he received as part of a subscription?
Yeah, that's a good thing, whether he was receiving objects as part of a subscription. I don't know whether the EES did objects to personal individuals. It did even back then. Yeah.
In the old days.
Yeah.
At the end of an expedition, there would be a share out.
Mhm.
Receipts. Obviously, the Antiquity Service would keep
Yeah.
the best stuff. But the rest would be shared out to, well, the EES, it might be, or of course you would get collectors who put money into the operation, like Mr. Ogden, like Jesse Howarth in Lancashire.
Yeah.
People like this, and they would get a cut
Yeah.
of what was going on. And even when I first came into the game in the 1960s, that system still operated. It doesn't operate now.
Yeah. Yeah, I know that the EES were certainly obviously giving objects to museums and stuff, but in terms of individuals, that I wasn't sure about. I know Garstein, obviously, he was doing it with his organization, Jesse Harworth, as you mentioned, and McGregor and others were receiving objects from that.
And
Yeah.
people like Carter.
And Carter. Yeah. Yes.
In Lord Carnarvon's a great palace.
Yeah. So just a comment there. I don't know if you've heard it on Zoom to say that obviously Howard Carter was also pickpocketing objects and potentially giving them to JRO and others. And be interesting to see if you come across any letters in the archives that might relate to objects that he was given.
There are some slightly later letters in the British Museum that when he was funding, helping to fund the ore dig, he'd write various letters trying to butter up people for money. He would suggest that the British Museum send, a brick or something to a potential sort of target for funding. So yes, I think things were circulating in order to sort of bring, raise money for the.
Anybody else in the audience here? Or Sam's got some on Zoom, so I'm gonna wander over here.
Thank you, Kent. So the first question, lots of people have been commenting, saying what a fantastic collaboration this is with Harrogate, with the Egypt Centre, with external researchers. How can they support this project? How can they find out more? Are you accepting donations from people to help support the work? Are there any upcoming events to support the work?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to support us, Sam can certainly put our donation link into the chat there. That will certainly support us. We're going to be doing a third conference, or a third event, which is going to be potentially delayed a little bit. As many of you know, we're going to be refurbishing the Egypt Centre House of Death gallery next year. So we were initially planning our third Harrogate exhibition next September, October time. That is probably going to be delayed until we reopen again. But certainly you can support this project by just passing the word out and letting people aware of the collection that we have here in Swansea. Not just the Egypt Centre itself, but also the Harrogate collection. But yeah, we're grateful for any support that people can give us. Don't know why I walked over there. I should have just stayed here.
Thank you. So Maria asks, this is to do with the close contacts of these specialist groups. Is that why the Ogden collection is such a lovely group? Is it coming from his specialization in jewelry? Is that what gave him this good eye? Or is it just this kind of in the know element that you have with Egyptologists, that you had to know the right people?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think certainly from the amulets and scarabs, they make sense in terms of a jeweler wanting those objects because they are so small, intricate pieces. They're also very attainable if you're traveling in Egypt, and he could have just been purchasing them while he was there. We were chatting earlier as to, we don't know exactly how JRO, what he did with these objects. Did he display them in his shop at home? We know obviously Kent had all his in his museum at home, but with the Ogden collection, we don't know so much. Don't know if you want to.
No, I mean, we don't. We know that his house had all the, the slides and a library and everything else, but we're not. We don't know whether or not he had glass cases with these artifacts on display, or I don't think it was a particularly public space. But yeah, I mean, it was when the 30s was when he started to sort of distribute all the items to various museums. But until that date, I'm not sure really. But yeah, it's one of those things we don't really understand. But the slides were very much hidden up in the attic, I think. Yeah.
So hopefully.
Society of Antiquaries. That would have given him access to a large number of experts.
Yeah. So a comment there just to say that he was a member of the Fellow of Antiquities, so he would have had access to lots of scholars and researchers, etc., who had material and the expertise. Yeah, which I think makes sense. Any other final comments? Because I know we're getting to 4 o'clock, dead on 4 o'clock almost. Anything else online, Sam? Oh.
Were there any Egyptological reproductions sold or Egyptian jewelry by Ogden?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Were there any reproductions, etc., of Egyptian objects? So I will pass you over to Robert.
Yes, we actually, I mean, last year we had, we were celebrating, an anniversary for the business, but also marking 100 years since the find. It was meant to be 2022, but we bit delayed getting it going. And Joanne Fletcher came in and did a talk, and she had uncovered pictures of jewelry that we'd made in the 1920s and 30s, beautiful diamond sets of Egyptian themed jewelry. So we very much were part of the sort of Egyptian fashion wave that hit the country, sort of Egyptomania. But also a lot of the replicas that he was making, some of them were for to sort of test the methods that might have been used. A lot of them were gifts for clients or for people funding expeditions. I'm not sure how many were sold. I think they were mainly just for him to gift to his friends and supporters of the digs.
I don't know as well if you want to kind of say anything about the shop in terms of the museum above. Is that accessible to anybody if they come and visit?
Yeah, I mean, I've probably made it sound slightly grander than it is. It's quite a small archive, but it just tells a little bit of the story of the shop. And there was quite a well-known Harrogate historian who died last year, Malcolm Neal, who's written up a lot of the history of Harrogate and covered a little bit of this, and did a book for us. So we've also got those that we can hand out. But yeah, I mean, we have JRO's sort of history of his interests, his many interests in archaeology, and it wasn't just in the sort of Middle East. It was also a lot of local archaeology. The Battle of Marston Moor and things he researched quite a lot, and also just a bit of history of the shop, and also the First World War letters that we've put on display, but they're just upstairs in the shop.
Any final remarks, questions? All done? Okay, so what we're going to do now is I'm going to hopefully connect my phone to Zoom, and I'm going to go upstairs and just give those people who are joining us online a look at the exhibition before we have those people who are joining us in person the opportunity to see the exhibition, but also get yourself a drink. We have some wine and soft drinks upstairs along with some nibbles. The galleries are open, so you'll be able to have a quick look through those as well. So it'll be around about 10 minutes for those that are in person that you'll be able to come up and join us. So if you're online, just give me 2 minutes until I connect and get upstairs. The case that we have for the Ogden collection, so you can see that we've got the 51 objects that are on display here. Given that they are quite small, we were able to get more in than the 30 that we would usually go for. We've started off with the interpretation board at the top, giving us some details about Ogden and his collection. Of course, everything has to be bilingual, so it's not only in English, it's also in Welsh. If anybody is reading that, I'll keep it there for a second. And then we have the portrait picture of Ogden just next to it. We've kept it short on here, just called it the Ogden collection rather than the highlights of the Ogden collection, because of course, again, it has to be in Welsh, so there's limited space available for that. The centerpiece of the case and the display is this fantastic mask, which you've already seen me talk about today. And that's flanked on either side, and I should just go up the top so that you can actually see the decoration that you've also got there, which you may not have seen in the presentation. And flanking on either side is the Shabti figures in no particular order. So we've got the one of Paddy Amun on the left-hand side. And what I'll quickly do is, that's Paddy Amun, is just go over to this case, because we also have the other Paddy Amun from the Egypt Centre collection right at the very back there. But that's a little detour. Then we have our stone Shabti that we looked at earlier from the New Kingdom. And then next to that, we have the Shabti of Jed Her. So quite a plain Shabti of the late period, typical of the late period. On this side, 3 further Shabtis. In the center, we have Penajim II, quite well-known high priest of Amun and de facto ruler. While on the left-hand side here, we have Samtek Men. So that's another late period Shabti. The one on the far right is the one that Meg discussed in detail of Hornacht, which gives the inscription on the back pillar or the corrections on the back pillar. Moving down onto the second row, we've got some amulets on display. And as you've already seen, they're really beautiful amulets that Ogden had as part of his collection. They're really nice agate wadget eye in the top left, and then one of the jade pillars. We only put one of the 4 or 5 on display, just as a representation of each of them. But certainly all of the amulets could have gone on display. They're such nice pieces and really complete. Next to that, we've got 3 of the gods, Anubis, possibly Reharakti and Thoth. At the back, you can see Bes, and then next to that, you've got the 2 goddesses, Isis, the one of lapis lazuli, followed by the one of Nephthys. Then we have the 2 triads, and I'll try and tilt it this way to get away from the mirror. We have the 2 triads as one stand together, and then next to those is this fantastic amulet of Bastet. We know that because of the inscription, which is on the back, which I think it's gone too blurry. Let me see if I can click on it to focus. Will that focus? No, it won't. But the inscription on the back is given us the details as to who it is. You can see she's holding this wadget eye in her hand. It's a really nice piece.
The photographs are available in the online catalogue, though, if anyone does want to see the back.
Exactly, yeah. And there we have our mirror, possibly of Greco-Roman period, but at this stage we don't know the context, which makes it quite difficult to say for certainty. We've got the 2 faience tiles of Seti II. Next to that, the coal pot. Unfortunately, no provenance as to where that's coming from. But then the necklace, which I showed you earlier, is supposedly coming from the site of Tuna El Gebel. But whether it does or not is, of course, difficult to say. The scarabs, we've got 12 on display, but really nice to kind of see. They're often difficult to kind of display because, of course, they're double-sided. Instead of showing the scarab side itself, we've gone for the inscriptional or decorative side. The next row, we have, of course, our ostrakon with the goose fat. And then next to that, the collection of 4 of the forgeries next to one another, including this quite nice one, really, imitating the stela of Seti, of Amenhotep I. We have the canopic jar head on display on its own rather than as a set with the jar, because of course the jar was part of the Kent collection rather than being part of the Ogden collection. And then on this shelf we have our cuneiform inscriptions, starting with our dedicatory cone. Then we have the cylinder seal. Not sure how well that's going to show up on the screen. We have our envelope. And then just 2 cuneiform tablets, which I've put on to say display to show the different sizes we've got. Down at the bottom, we have our stela of Uafni Arpishishi. And then 2 pieces of pottery from the site of Ur. And finally, the stamped mud brick with the name of Nebuchadnezzar II. So I'll just zoom back again. There you can see all the objects that we do have on display. I hope you have the opportunities, some of you, to come and visit and maybe see the collection in person. That's a very, very quick, obviously, overview before everybody else comes in and it gets too noisy. Was somebody asking a question? Yep.
May says it looks great and she'll be coming to see it soon.
Oh, good, good. Hello, May. Good to see you on here. Does anybody have any questions before we go?
Nothing in the chat yet. Speak now or forever hold your peace.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming along and supporting us with this fantastic project. We are really fortunate to have it here in Swansea, and we're very grateful to May, as well as to the other curators in Harrogate, for really allowing this collection to come here and for us to be the custodians for a number of years. We are fortunate to get it out on display here. What I will quickly do, although it's not part of the collection, but since, or not part of the Ogden collection, but since they're here, here's just a few other Harrogate items that we have on display. these beautiful terracotta figurines. But I shouldn't get distracted by giving you a tour of the whole collection. There's something that's not Harrogate, but this is our beautiful tunic from the Egypt Centre collection. So if you do get the opportunity to come to Swansea, do get in touch, let us know, and we'll be happy to show you around and show you the collection.
Before this turns into another one of Ken's 4-hour tours.
I know. That's what I'm worried about. But there's a lot of people outside the door, so I'm going to disconnect here so I can allow people into the room. And thank you again, everybody, for supporting us.